Okay, so welcome to the final video for chapter 3, where we're going to talk about energy and how cells get energy. And we're going to specifically focus on cellular respiration, which is where cells take glucose, so that um, monosaccharide, the carbohydrate, simple sugar, and convert it into ATP molecules, which is then used as a direct energy source for a lot of our cellular processes. Okay? And those cellular processes that we are referring to is basically all of the chemical reactions that we have in our bodies. And the sum of all of those chemical reactions we refer to as metabolism. So that's basically what we mean whenever we say metabolism, just all of those chemical reactions. And so if you have a high metabolism, then your body has those chemical reactions happening at a fairly high rate, which means that you're using your energy at a fairly high rate. So you're using your carbohydrate sources at a high rate. So they don't tend to build up in your body. And then if your metabolism is slower, then you use them at a slower rate. And so there are two types of metabolic pathways. You have anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism is assembling those larger molecules. So you can think of those dehydration synthesis reactions where you're taking monomers and making polymers, and you're requiring ATP to do so. Okay. Catabolism, opposite, so you can think of hydrolysis, where you're taking those larger molecules and breaking them down, so breaking down polymers into monomers, and then we're releasing energy from that process. So we're making ATP in that process. So we have that ATP, or that energy output. And so the cells, they use that energy and as it's transformed, and so they use it and store it, basically, is what I should say. And so every chemical reaction that happens in our body requires a specific enzyme, a specific protein to work and to function. And these metabolic activities also require a lot of energy. So that means our bodies need a lot of proteins to make the enzymes, and we also need a lot of ATP for the energy that those cellular reactions or those cellular processes need in order to function. And so energy in our bodies and our cells are often um, used in the form of ATP. And if you remember at the end of our chemistry lecture, we went through this how ATP works, right? The adenosine triphosphate, how there's a lot of energy in that third and second phosphate group, and that third phosphate group can be cleaved off, and the energy in that chemical bond between those two is released, and then that released energy is used to do whatever chemical reaction or transport mechanism that's needed. Because as we just learned, ATP, that energy is used to move molecules against their concentration gradient. And then the ADP can have another phosphate added back onto it, and can be turned back into an ATP molecule. So it can basically be recycled. And so with animals, glucose is, well, plants as well. Plants just can make their own glucose. Um, Glucose is providing the cells with energy. Like I said, those are the primary energy caches that organisms use in terms of cellular processes and metabolism. So energy in glucose is used to make that ATP. One glucose molecule under really efficient cellular processes can make about, so this is about 36 ATP molecules. If there's no glucose, the body can break down fats and proteins to make ATP. Um, and the ATP is you can primarily think of it as like your pocket change. So you're going to use that right before you use any other form. And the glucose is basically the storage of those ATP. So basically, what you can have is you can have multiple glucose molecules that make up a glycogen molecule. And let's say, oh, the cell needs energy, so it takes this glucose molecule and turns it into 36 ATP, and then it saves these three for later. And let's say the cell needs more energy. It'll take this glucose molecule, makes 36 ATP, and then it has 2 left for later, right? So maybe not exactly how it happens, but that's kind of a good example of how glucose and the carbohydrates are basically the stash, and then, or the savings, and then the ATP is like your cash in hand, right? The energy you have to use. Now, the process of converting the glucose into ATP requires 4 different steps to happen. And that process is part of, or those 4 steps are part of the cellular respiration process, which is just the breakdown of glucose using oxygen to make ATP. So you have your glucose, your oxygen, cellular respiration gives you water and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. The energy that comes from that is put into 36 ATP molecules. Those ATP molecules can make larger molecules. They can transport molecules across plasma membranes. That ATP can be used to cause muscle contractions. You'll learn all about muscle contractions in detail whenever we talk about the muscle system. And then those ATP molecules, after they're used, are converted into ADP, and then the individual phosphate groups. And then those ADP can then be recycled through cellular respiration and then be used again for more cellular work. So what is cellular respiration and the processes that it includes? Well, like I said, there's 4 stages to cellular respiration. The first is glycolysis. Then there's the prep step, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport system. You'll hear me say ETS just because it's shorter, and I'm referring to the electric transport system when I say ETS. These 3 are all in the mitochondria. The glycolysis it occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay, we have a figure here where it shows glycolysis in the cytoplasm, and then your last 3 steps, your prep step, your citric acid cycle, and your electron transport system, they all happen within the mitochondria. Each step gives off net ATP except for the prep step. Okay? But the majority of the ATP, I think it's 32 ATP, is made in the final phase, or the final step. That's the electron transport system. So we're going to talk about each of these individual steps through the remainder of this video. All right, so glycolysis in the cytoplasm. Okay, so glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm. There's basically 10 reactions that take glucose and split it into 2 molecules. Okay, so the key thing with glucose is it's a 6-carbon molecule, right? 6-carbon molecule. Basically what glycolysis is doing is it's taking this 6-carbon molecule, it's splitting it into 2, and it's making 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay, these 2 3-carbon molecules are called pyruvate. And this process of splitting that glucose, it requires energy to do so. So it requires 2 ATP molecules. But we get 4 ATP molecules from the production of the pyruvate. So if we get 4 used to, we're left with a net yield of 2. So glycolysis gives us a net yield of 2 ATP molecules. So out of the 36 ATP molecules we're supposed to make, we've already made 2 with glycolysis. Okay. What also happens in glycolysis is there are these molecules called NAD+. Okay. These NAD+ molecules during glycolysis will pick up a hydrogen ion and be turned into NADH. NADH will then be stored and used later in the ETS to make the remaining ATP. Now, NADH is basically a energetic molecule. Okay, so in this whole process, we have one glucose molecule, which is a 6-carbon molecule. We have our energy investment of 2 ATP molecules, and you end up splitting that glucose molecule and making a pyruvate molecule, 2 pyruvate molecules, okay? And so we end up with, so from 1 glucose, right, you end up with 2 pyruvate, 2 NADH, and 2 net ATP, okay? Just notice it makes 4, right? And so this NADH will be saved. The ATP will be saved to use later. The pyruvate here will go on to the next step. And that next step is the preparatory step, okay? And so with the prep step, that pyruvate will enter the mitochondria. So it goes from the cytosol into the mitochondria, and the pyruvate is converted into acetyl-CoA. Now, this happens by a pyruvate molecule being converted into an acetyl group and producing carbon dioxide. Okay, and so carbon dioxide is made here. And what also happens is a coenzyme called coenzyme A attaches to this molecule. And so you have your pyruvate converted into an acetyl group. Then the acetyl group combines with coenzyme A to form acetyl-CoA. Okay, so this is one product from the prep step. So you get acetyl-CoA, but you also get another NADH molecule made. Okay, and what you want to remember is, remember we started with 2 pyruvate molecules. So this happens 2 times for every 1 glucose molecule. So we end up making a total of 2 NADH, right? And 2 acetyl-CoAs. Okay. So here we have a figure. We're showing each pyruvate, right? So this, again, this happens 2 times. Right? So pyruvate made into acetyl-CoA, acetyl group. Carbon dioxide's made, NADH is made, and then coenzyme A combines with that acetyl group and makes acetyl-CoA. Right? Now, acetyl-CoA will then move on to the next step, which is the citric acid cycle, or also known as the Krebs cycle. This also occurs in the mitochondria, and there's 8 different reactions that happen. But basically what's happening is this acetyl-CoA molecule is going to be broken down, and through that process of breaking it down, NADH will be made, and a new energy molecule that we haven't seen in the cellular respiration process yet is made, which is FADH2. Okay. Now, per cycle, So remember, we have 2 acetyl-CoAs that are made. So every one acetyl group, acetyl-CoA, will make 1 NADH. I'm sorry, it makes 2 NADH and 1 FADH2 molecule and 1 ATP and 2 CO2. So let's just write this down. So for every 1 turn of the cycle, right, you get 2 NADH, 1 FADH2, you get 1 ATP, and you get 2 CO2. So every 1 turn, okay, that's how much you get. And so remember, this happens 2 times, which means you get 2 ATP total and 4 carbon dioxide per glucose molecule. Okay. So now with the glycolysis, remember we had a net of 2 ATP, and then the citric acid cycle, you have a net of 2 ATP. So we're at 4 ATP so far. So the last step is the ETS, and so that means it's going to make about 32 ATP molecules, okay, approximately. All right. So here's a figure showing this. So you have your acetyl-CoA, right? It gets converted into a 6-carbon molecule. This 6-carbon molecule is made because the acetyl group has 2 carbons. Then there's this 4-carbon molecule, this oxaloacetate or acetate, oxaloacetate. There we go. The 4-carbon binds with the 2-carbon to make the 6-carbon. Okay? And then through 2 reactions, you don't have to know these reactions, but just know that from this 6-carbon, which is the citric acid, this is where the name comes from, the citric acid cycle. This 6-carbon is broken down into a 4-carbon molecule. Okay. Now, this 4-carbon molecule will continue on to basically be recycled to be used again. Okay. But the key point through this cycle here, as it breaks it from a 6 to a 4-carbon, is making the NADHs, the ATP, and the FADH2. Because the NADHs that have been made so far and the NADHs made in this cycle and that FADH2 molecule is going to go on to the electron transport system and make ATP. And so now once we get to the final step, the ETS, the electron transport system, this is now on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So remember we said it had 2 membranes. So this is on the inner membrane. So there are a series of proteins that are embedded in that inner membrane. And what happens is there are electrons that are removed from these NADH molecules and the FADH2 molecules, and those electrons provide energy to move hydrogen ions against their concentration gradient. And so what's happening is there's this concentration gradient that's being set up across that inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it's creating this diffusion gradient. And that diffusion gradient is going to be used to make the ATP molecules. Okay. And now the reason oxygen is needed in the cellular respiration process is because the final electron's receptor at the end of the ETS has to be oxygen. Okay? And so if this oxygen is not here, the electron transport system breaks down and ATP is not able to be made. And so cellular respiration stops. So that oxygen is very important. And that oxygen, when it binds with that final electron, it forms water. Okay, and so that's where the metabolic water comes from. And so ATP is generated, and this process is known as oxidative phosphorylation. Okay. So here we'll show a figure of the electron transport system. So you have your NADH molecule, your FAD2 molecules. The electrons are lost from those molecules, and the energy from those electrons are pushing these hydrogen ions in between the inner membrane and the outer membrane. And so notice here, right? This is where we're zoomed in. So this is the outer membrane of the mitochondria, and this is the inner membrane. So this area is this inner space here, whereas this area is that tiny space there, okay? So this is why I said these spaces are going to become important. So if you notice, the space between the inner membrane and the outer membrane has a high hydrogen concentration. The space in the inner membrane has a low hydrogen concentration. So in order to move those hydrogens into that space between the inner and outer membranes, energy is needed. And that energy comes from the electrons from the NADH and the FADH molecules. And remember, we made those molecules from the glycolysis, the prep step, and the citric acid cycle. And then once those hydrogen ions are pushed in that space between the outer and inner membrane, that makes this gradient, has this gradient set up. So now these hydrogen ions want to diffuse back in passively, but they can't down here because these proteins only let hydrogen go one way, let it go out of the inner membrane. However, the ATP synthase enzyme here, let me erase this ink. So here, this ATP synthase enzyme allows the hydrogen to diffuse back into the inner membrane. So this is a passive movement, so no energy is required. But every hydrogen that moves through, it's moving and has that kinetic energy, and so it's got energy associated with that movement as it moves down that concentration gradient. And so you can think of this as like a turbine. So basically, as that hydrogen moves, it spins the turbine in the enzyme, and that energy is captured in the bond between the second and third phosphate group. And so the ADP, so this phosphate is basically slammed onto the ADP and makes an ATP molecule. And there's enough energy in the NADH and the FADH2 molecules that were made in the previous steps to make approximately 32 ATP molecules in the ETS. Okay, so the setup of this concentration gradient is key for setting up the energy to run that ATP synthase enzyme. Okay, so here we just have a quick summary of the production of glucose. So many different enzymes are used. We get approximately 36 ATP molecules. We use oxygen, generate carbon dioxide. And so cellular respiration is that process that, again, uses oxygen, produces carbon dioxide to make ATP. So here we have a figure that's kind of summing up all of the products that's made. in each of these different steps. Right? So remember, we use 2 ATP in glycolysis. We make 4, so that means we net 2, right? We net 2 ATP. We gained 2 NADH molecules. The prep step doesn't make any ATP, but we get NADH. The citric acid cycle makes 6 NADH and 2 FADH. The citric acid cycle also generates 2 ATP. ATP is used to shuttle electrons from the NADH in the cytosol to the in the mitochondria. So the NADH from glycolysis, so this stage here, needs ATP to be made or to travel. And so then you get about 34, so 32, 34, depending on the efficiency. And so you end up with about a total of 36 net ATP molecules. And I just want to check, I think I missed 1, 2, yeah, I missed one. Silly me. A third NADH is made there. Right? So I said, where was it at? I think I said 2 NADH per turn. It's actually 3 NADH per turn. There we go. So that's the total of 6. And so just to quickly finish up, so remember, glycogen is, the real kind of stash of energy because it's made up of glucose. And we just showed how glucose can be converted into many, many ATP molecules. And so when it's needed, it breaks it down. And so it's really only 1% of our total energy reserves in our body, whereas fats make up like 78%. Triglycerides actually have twice the energy of carbohydrates, but our bodies use those carbohydrates before they use fats. And so, that has to deal with that there tells you that if you eat a lot of carbs or if you eat a lot of fats, and depending on how your body puts that on, and then how energetic you are and how high your metabolism is, right? If you're constantly have carbohydrates for your body to use, it'll never burn those fats because it will always use those carbohydrates first. And then the last store that it would use is our proteins. 21% of our energy reserve is proteins, but they have about the same amount as carbohydrates. And again, we really don't want to be breaking down our enzymes or our proteins that are really essential for our cellular processes. And then this is just to show, here's the cellular respiration pathway from glycogen to glucose. But fats and proteins also can be inserted at different points along that pathway. Right? So a fat can be broken down into fatty acids that can then be turned into acetyl-CoA, or it could be broken down into glycerol, which then is broken down into pyruvate and takes the general pathway of glycolysis. And then proteins can be broken down into amino acids, which could enter in 3 or 4 different steps into the cellular respiration. So again, whatever step you go in is dependent on what you're breaking down. But for purposes of knowing cellular respiration, we're following that glucose pathway. So glycolysis, the prep step, the citric acid cycle to the ETS. And so just one other thing I want you to be familiar with is so cellular respiration is an oxygen-based pathway. It needs oxygen to happen. And again, that's because that last electron receptor here is oxygen, right? And so that makes water. If this is not there, if you don't have oxygen, this whole chain shuts down, falls apart, and doesn't work. And so your body then can't make ATP, or it can't make ATP through this process. However, it can make ATP through an anaerobic pathway, which is basically without oxygen. So glycolysis will still continue, right? Because glycolysis doesn't need oxygen to to happen. But what happens is the pyruvate will build up because it's not being used up. It's not being converted into acetyl-CoA, and it's not that acetyl-CoA is not being broken down and turned into NADH and FADH2. And so that pyruvate will then be converted to lactic acid as it builds up. And then that lactic acid, a buildup of lactic acid, is actually what causes your muscles to burn whenever you've been active for a long period of time consistently. And so basically what's happening is your body's running out of oxygen to convert the glucose into ATP through cellular respiration, but glycolysis is still happening, and you're getting lactic acid buildup in your muscles, so you end up with that burning and soreness in your muscles. Now, with this anaerobic process, 2 ATP molecules are still made in glycolysis, just like normal, but that's nowhere near 36 molecules that you net when cellular respiration can happen in the presence of oxygen. And then whenever oxygen becomes available again, that lactic acid is metabolized aerobically, and the body gets rid of it. And so you basically have this little process here where that glycolysis happens but never enters the mitochondria to finish the prep step, the citric acid cycle, and the ETS. You're left with that lactic acid buildup, and so you get that muscle soreness until oxygen becomes present again. And so the last thing we have is just an animation showing this cellular respiration process, and then that'll be it for chapter 3.
Cells break down glucose and derive energy from it by using an oxygen-requiring pathway called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has 4 phases. The breakdown of glucose begins with glycolysis, which occurs in the cytoplasm. The next 3 phases of cellular respiration, the transition reaction, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain, all occur within mitochondria. In glycolysis, glucose with 6 carbons is split into 2 molecules called pyruvate with 3 carbons each. Glycolysis occurs in several steps, each of which requires a specific enzyme. During the first steps, 2 molecules of ATP are consumed, providing glucose with the energy for splitting. During the remaining steps, 4 molecules of ATP are produced, for a net gain of 2 ATP. Glycolysis also delivers energetic electrons from glucose to molecules called NAD+, forming the energy-carrying NADH molecules. Note that glycolysis does not require oxygen. The pyruvate molecules from glycolysis move from the cytoplasm into the inner compartment of the mitochondrion. Let's look at the fate of just one of these molecules. Pyruvate reacts with a substance called coenzyme A, CoA, in a reaction called the transition reaction. The transition reaction results in the removal of 1 carbon in the form of carbon dioxide or CO2 from pyruvate. The resulting 2-carbon molecule called an acetyl group then binds to CoA to form acetyl-CoA. A molecule of NADH is also produced from each pyruvate. In the next set of reactions called the citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle, acetyl-CoA is stripped of its final carbon atoms in the form of carbon dioxide. During these reactions, energy is captured and stored in ATP, NADH, and another energy-carrying molecule called FADH2. The cycle begins when acetyl-CoA reacts with a 4-carbon compound to form a 6-carbon compound. By the end of the reactions in this cycle, the 4-carbon compound is regenerated and can participate in another round of reactions. The NADH and FADH2 produced in the previous phases enter the electron transport chain, the final phase of cellular respiration. A series of carrier proteins, the electron transport chain, embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, accept the high-energy electrons from NADH and FADH2. Eventually, the electrons are passed to oxygen, the final electron acceptor, which then combines with 2 hydrogen ions to form water. Without oxygen, the transport chain comes to a halt, blocking the citric acid cycle and stopping cellular respiration. During the transfer of electrons from one protein to the next, energy is released and used to make ATP. Altogether, cellular respiration produces 36 molecules of ATP per molecule of glucose, 2 ATP from glycolysis, 2 ATP from the citric acid cycle, and 32 ATP from the electron transport chain. Although cellular respiration requires oxygen, cells can still harvest a small amount of energy from glucose when oxygen is scarce. Fermentation is the breakdown of glucose without oxygen. It begins with glycolysis, which produces 2 molecules of pyruvate from a molecule of glucose. Importantly, it results in a net gain of 2 ATP and 2 NADH molecules. The remaining reactions of fermentation also take place in the cytoplasm, transferring electrons from NADH to pyruvate. In this example of lactic acid fermentation, which takes place in muscles during vigorous exercise, the result is 2 molecules of lactate. This reaction is critical because it regenerates NAD+, which is essential for the production of ATP through glycolysis. Fermentation is a very inefficient way for cells to harvest energy. It nets only 2 molecules of ATP, compared with the 36 molecules of ATP produced by cellular respiration.
All right, so that's a really good video to sum up, all of the details of cellular respiration and the 4 kind of sub processes within it. So I would recommend kind of maybe watching this video 1 or 2 more times at least, just so you can get a handle on cellular respiration. And so with cellular respiration, you don't need to know like all of the little steps, but you need to know kind of the big changes. So like glucose to pyruvate, pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA making NADH, FADH, which ones make ATP. So like glycolysis makes 2, citric acid cycle makes 2, and then all of those products, the NADH, FADH2, go to the ETS, which is then where a majority of the 36 ATP molecules are made. So you want to be able to kind of explain it that way and explain what's happening overall in each step. So that does it for our 3rd video in this module, and it's our final video. So this is it for chapter 3. We'll pick up in our next module on chapter 4, where we start looking at organs and organ systems, and we'll talk about kind of the general tissues and stuff in the body before we get into like chapter 5 and 6, and where we start looking at actual organ systems themselves. And then that'll be what the rest of the summer session is the organ systems that we'll become familiar with in the human body. And so with that, I hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you in the next module.